My name is Diane Buglioli, and I'm on the board of directors of a very special place, Incorporated, which provides services to individuals with developmental disabilities as well as their families. I'm also one of the founders of the organization. My other hat that I wear is that I'm the co-chairperson of the Willowbrook Property Committee of the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities Council, which is the primary advocacy agency here on Staten Island for people with developmental disabilities and their families. I also am on the Willowbrook Legacy Project, which is a collaborative committee of three main stakeholders: the College of Staten Island, the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities Council, and the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. Finally, I am the host of Willowbrook Revisited, and welcome to this segment of Willowbrook Revisited. For those of you that haven't seen it in the past, Willowbrook Revisited is a retrospective look at the Willowbrook experience, the property it was located on, the people who lived there, the people who worked there, and the events that happened on that property, and the tremendous impact that those events had. This year, interestingly, is the year of Willowbrook. It's the year of many anniversaries. The anniversary of the opening of Willowbrook, 75 years ago. The expose about the horrendous conditions at Willowbrook was 50 years ago. And 35 years ago, on September 17th, Willowbrook was closed. This year, in the year of Willowbrook, on September 17th, there'll be a ribbon cutting for the opening of the Willowbrook Mile. I have with me today as guests two colleagues, two friends, two community activists, both of whom have been on the show before, Laura and Hal Kennedy. Welcome, and perhaps just reintroduce yourself to the audience. It's been a few years since our last show.
Right.
Yeah?
Well, it's great to be here. The Willowbrook story has been a great part of our lives, and I just am so enamored by the attention that this very important issue is getting. I am serving on the board of AHRC New York City, and I have been a past president of that organization and the ARC New York, and now on the national board of directors, and those organizations played a significant role in the Willowbrook story. So as a parent of Julia, who is 40 now, this really comes home to how important it is in all of our lives.
And as Diane said, my name is Hal Kennedy. I too am a parent, as Laura just mentioned. I serve on the board of the Historical Society, the courts, and a number of other boards. But before I get into any further, I would like to take this moment to acknowledge again Diane and thank her for the extraordinary job that she has done and continues to do in making sure that we don't forget, that we understand Willowbrook's past, we understand its present, and we understand where we ought to be going in the future. So Diane, for all that you do, we thank you very much. It really is a pleasure working with you on this project and continually working with you on this project as it moves forward. But Willowbrook is important. I am an attorney, and I realize just how important the Willowbrook lawsuit and the Willowbrook consent judgment is, and has those two documents, actually, the lawsuit and the consent judgment, the role that they have played in developing and continuing services for people with developmental disabilities. So it's a pleasure to be here, and Diane, we look forward to continuing this conversation.
All right. You know, the Willowbrook Mile is a concept that started around 2005 with the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities Council. And then we were joined with the College of Staten Island around 2012. And so it's the culmination of a tremendous amount of work, and we thank everyone that's been involved, including yourselves. But I wanted to be able to tell the audience about the Willowbrook Mile. This Willowbrook Mile represents a living timeline of lessons and progress. We're going to introduce them to the milestones or the stations, and that share with the person who walks through the needed information to ensure that such institutions such as Willowbrook never happen again. You know, remembering the past to protect the future is really the mission of the mile. And then I want to just also, I thank you for that, but I'm old enough now to know that no one ever accomplishes anything alone. So there have been so many people involved in it, including yourselves, the original Willowbrook Mile committee, and then people got added, and then when the college came in, the tremendous effort from the college, from Thomas Morales forward to Bill Fritz, who really carried the legacy of that property forward and put it forefront, which made this process move even better. And if people want to know more about it, you can go to the College of Staten Island website. The Willowbrook project is coordinated by Professor Catherine Lavender and Nora Santiago, but you can go on that website. And I'll just insert it right here. And if anyone is watching this because they have someone with a developmental disability and they need some help or assistance, you can also go on the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities website, which is siddc.org, to find a contact. So let's proceed and talk a little bit about this mile, which is meant to give people the texture of that Willowbrook experience. And not just the experience itself, but really the history of the property, which is in itself is quite interesting. Hal is an expert on Halloran Hospital. Some people won't even know that it was there. So we're going to go through the stations in order. There are 12 stations. They're set up, each one has a pylon that identifies the station, and then there is a signage that explains the focus of that station and the import of it. And it actually goes through what was the original Willowbrook campus, which was over 385 acres, and now it's divided into the College of Staten Island, the Elizabeth Conley Resource Center, and the Institute for Basic Research. So basically, there are 12 stations that it's around 1.5 miles long, actually, that one would walk through. So let's start. We'll start right with Station 1, Laura, which is the archives.
Yes, it's 1.5 mile trail, but a 1,000,000-mile story. And I think the 12 stations have significant contributions to someone really understanding the struggle from beginning to end. And what better place to start than is the archive. These archives and special collections at CSI opened up in the year 2000. In the last 22 years, there's been a significant amount of contributions to the history of developmental disabilities, the struggle for social justice through the Willowbrook consent judgment. And those contributions have been made by many of the individuals who have been on this show with Diane, who have been part of that lawsuit and the struggle. And it is growing. It is really the one point where society, advocates, teachers, future authors can go and research this history. As Diane said, the past is going to help us design the future. So the collection is in the library. It's the first station, and it's on the second floor. James Kaiser is the archivist, and significant amount of collection that can be obtained and looked through by appointment. And this collection is growing as we speak. There are a number of groups that are very interested in disability history. And so we look forward to the growth of the archives. And they do have a display, which will be open on Saturday during the ribbon cutting, that will also show some very good documents about the Willowbrook story. So that is Station 1.
If I could just take a moment, though, and give a shout out to our former Assemblywoman and a real angel in this field, Betty Conley. Because Betty Conley was one of the architects, if you will, for the Willowbrook archives. The College of Staten Island had gotten money for archives for Senator John Markey and also for Assemblyman Eric Vitaliano to put their papers there. And also Betty's papers would also go there. But Betty was adamant that the College of Staten Island also house Willowbrook archives because she was interested. The Betty Conley story is perhaps we can get onto that a little bit later on when we talk about the Conley Center. but she really was, in so many ways, a guardian for all of us. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Okay. The second station is Building 19. And Building 19, there was a plaque placed there a number of years ago honoring the people that lived there. And we're preserving that station really to tell the story of what an institution was like and the devastation to an individual and the isolation. As a person, I've shared the story before that I worked at Willowbrook. So at Building 19 and at all of the buildings, there was one thing in common. Although you would call it a residential building, there was nothing like a residence for the people that lived there. There was no furniture. There was no nightstands. It was just a bedroom and then a day room. The day rooms were devoid of any type of supplies in terms of things for people to do to be productive. We can talk about, most people know the iconic shots of people just sitting aimlessly without activity. I tell the story of an individual that she was limping, and I was out on a walk with them. I was a recreation worker, and I asked to remove her shoe. I thought maybe she had a stone in it, and she fought with me. She didn't want to give me the shoe. I finally took the shoe off, and there was a wad inside her sock. And so I opened that up, and I kept opening it. It looked like paper mache almost. And I opened it, and when I opened it, it was a birthday card from her mother. There was no place else for her to put it. She didn't have anything. There were no personal possessions. The separation of a person from being a human being is something that is just the hallmark of institutionalization and why it should never happen again. So Building 19 is where we tell the story of this inhumane environment that was institutionalization. The third station is Halloran Hospital, Hal.
You know, when I think of the Willowbrook property, I think it is a study in contrast for sure. We had Willowbrook State School, which was started in 1938, although no one went to the school at that time because it was just being built. And of course, in 1941, World War II broke out, and the U.S. government needed medical facilities for the soldiers who they anticipated, and were right, of course, that they would be wounded and needed care. So they looked around New York State to find a suitable place, and of course they came upon the then being built Willowbrook State School, and decided that the buildings there would fit what they needed, with a little retrofitting, if you will. And they created Halloran Hospital. Halloran Hospital was a beautiful place, unlike Willowbrook State School. And when I talk about contrast, that's what I'm talking about. And the Willowbrook property really offers you a good glimpse as to how government can work for you and how government can work against you. But Halloran Hospital, again, created, it opened in 1942. It was a massive medical facility, the largest medical facility in the world. They would see over 2,000 soldiers a day. Now, you may say to yourself, how could that possibly be? How could an institution or a hospital handle 2,000 patients a day? And yet they were able to do that. What was the theory behind the hospital? Well, the theory was that if a soldier was hurt in Europe, they put that soldier on an airplane, flew him into the United States. They landed at Floyd Bennett Field out in Brooklyn or at Newark Airport. They moved that soldier immediately to Halloran via a ship or via trains. There were trains that went through New Jersey over by Holland Hook on Staten Island, and they brought those soldiers to the hospital, and they triaged them and decided which building they would be sent to on the grounds at now Willowbrook. There were different buildings for ophthalmology was a big one, eye injuries, and orthopedics, of course, for bone injuries, and infectious diseases. They had buildings for that. But they only held the soldier for, at most, 4 or 5 days. And the reason for that is that they were seeing 2,000 soldiers a day, new soldiers, and they had to move those soldiers out, and they sent those soldiers to their own home communities. Again, with the theory being that by sending a soldier to his home, he probably would convalesce much faster than being in a hospital away. And of course, they opened up space then. So the hospitals around the country, of course, were receiving Halloran patients. But Halloran really was the gold standard in medical care and also social care, if you will, for soldiers. It was a very, very nice, well-run place. The fellow who ran it was a General Ralph DeVoe, who, by all accounts, was a superb administrator. He understood what needed to be done, and he got it done. There was no shortages at Halloran Hospital. Everything and anything that needed to be done was provided for soldiers. They even had, believe it or not, and this is in the 1940s, they had live TV streaming hockey games and basketball games from Madison Square Garden. They had theater groups. They had Ed Sullivan would come over and bring other entertainers. Red Skeleton, for instance, Jimmy Durante. Frank Sinatra was on the Halloran grounds. So they really worked very, very hard. Another little interesting piece of the Halloran Hospital story is that it was also a POW camp. There were about 600 German and Italian prisoners of war that were there during the duration. The prisoners of war, of course, were put on work parties, and they worked in the kitchen, and they did carpentry work and what have you. But they were there, and they were very well received. Well, I should put an asterisk on that. The Italian prisoners of war were very well received on Staten Island, and the Italian prisoners of war were actually given passes so that they could go out in the community. I mean, it's incredible when you think about that. The German prisoners of war were not afforded the same benefit. The German prisoners of war were contained on the grounds of the Halloran Hospital. And there is a reported case of one prisoner of war, German prisoner of war, who escaped and went into Clove Lakes Park and spent the night in Clove Lakes Park. And then he turned around and escaped back into Halloran Hospital. And when he was asked, why did you escape back? Why did you come back? And he said, I got hungry, and it appeared that the food at Halloran would be better than anything else he'd find on Staten Island. So there are plenty of stories, and again, Halloran Hospital was really a gold, operated under the gold standard. At the end of the war, the Halloran Hospital was turned into a veterans hospital, which lasted till about 1951, and then Willowbrook was brought back to life, and Willowbrook people were brought in, and so that's the end of the Halloran story.
Yeah, and then I heard in my readings of it that it was one of the best orthopedic surgery hospitals that we had for our soldiers.
It certainly was, and it was plenty of publicity about Halloran Hospital, too. Life magazine did a couple of stories. The New Yorker did it. There were regular stories in the New York Times. I mean, part of it was the war propaganda. They wanted to let everyone know, including our enemies, that we were taking care of our soldiers, and they'd be back on the front lines sooner rather than later.
Moving on then to the consent judgment, which was Station 4, which is another area that you have great expertise in.
And this is again, the study in contrast. You're looking at Halloran Hospital, the government did great things, and now we're going to talk about essentially Willowbrook State School, where government had its issues and its problems. There's a consent judgment out there, and people hear about a Willowbrook consent judgment. Sometimes people refer to it as the Willowbrook consent decree. They're the same. A judgment or decree is sort of what happens at the end of a lawsuit. But you need a lawsuit before you can have a judgment. And a lawsuit was brought in 1972. In fact, there were two lawsuits that were brought in 1972 on the same day. You might say, well, how did that happen? Well, there were two competing, if you will, legal entities. One was the New York Civil Liberties Union, and the other was the New York Legal Aid Society, and both wanted to draft their own complaints. Rest assured, both of these legal entities worked collaboratively. They wrote their own complaints, and they filed them together on March 17th, 1972, in the Eastern District Court in Brooklyn. Of course, when they got there, they decided to flip a coin to see which entity would file their complaint first, and the New York Civil Liberties Union won that toss, so their complaint was filed before the Legal Aid Society was, by a factor of about 3 minutes. But what was the deal? I mean, what was the idea of having a complaint? I mean, what was going on? Well, if you look backwards a little bit, you know, we know the Geraldo Rivera story, and we know, of course, or you should know, the Staten Island Advance story, which is very, very important in terms of Willowbrook State School, because Jane Curtin, a reporter who has been on Diane shows before, really broke a story about the inhumane treatment of people at Willowbrook. The terrible, terrible conditions. I mean, one of the headlines in the newspaper read, "Inside the cages."
Let me jump in here, Hal, because I'm going to jump up to the 6th station so that we'll cover it, and then we'll come back to the consent judgment.
Okay.
The 6th station is exposing the conditions, and I just put this in here because we want to get through the 12 stations, right? Is that in 1965, Robert Kennedy comes, he calls it a snake pit, says the worst conditions ever seen. The New York Times runs one article. Nothing gets said. Nothing happens. 1971, Jane Curtin. Richard Diamond is the editor of the Advance, and the publisher of the Advance, excuse me, and he puts this young reporter on this series of articles, and they devote 17 some odd articles, starting with Inside the Cages. Hard-hitting, perceptive, saying these are the conditions. 1971. Sustained over and over again, pointing at government, pointing at the legislature, pointing at the Board of Visitors, getting people to be looking at this. And then 1972, with the termination of Dr. Wilkins, who has his key. He knows Geraldo Rivera. Geraldo Rivera goes in one night, and now it becomes visual. And it hits the media through Eyewitness News in 1972, exposing the conditions. And then this whole now thing start to move and evolve with the activists, resulting in the consent judgment.
Yes, absolutely. And the resulting first in filing the complaints, which needed to happen before we had the consent judgment. And the complaints really sort of laid out already what Geraldo and Jane Curtin had laid out, but in more legalistic language and appropriate language. I mean, the complaints were about 40 pages long. In fact, I have one of them that's here. And detailing the treatment of people at Willowbrook. I mean, treatment such as people being fed over 3 or 4 minute period instead of what you would normally find in eating, or people being denied appropriate medical care or dental care, or the facilities themselves lacking air conditioning or lacking appropriate heat, or lacking bathrooms. All of the things that were bad at Willowbrook were now put into a document called a complaint. The complaints filed. There are a few hearings that go forward. A judge came to Willowbrook to check himself to find out what the heck was really going on. And a year after the complaints are filed, he enters a temporary order telling the state of New York, clean up your act. And the state of New York tried to clean up their act a little bit, but didn't do quite the job that was necessary. The parties said, okay, we're going back to court, and they did, and they had a trial. And the trial lasted from October 1974 to January of 1975. Then what happened? Well, we got a new governor in New York, a guy by the name of Hugh Carey, and Hugh Carey ran on a platform that he was going to fix Willowbrook. He was going to do something about Willowbrook, and he directed his staff to negotiate with the plaintiff's attorney, the Legal Aid Society, and the ACLU, and come up with some sort of an agreement, and they did. And that's the consent judgment. The consent judgment is essentially a contract. It was a contract with the people that were then at Willowbrook, with the state of New York, and the contract was, we're going to have better conditions at Willowbrook. People are going to be fed appropriately. They're going to be clothed appropriately. They're going to have appropriate housing. There's going to be appropriate toileting. Things are going to get better. But the key with the Willowbrook consent judgment was not only were the people at Willowbrook going to things were going to get better, but they're going to work towards closing Willowbrook. And the deal was that Willowbrook was to reduce its population to 250 people by 1981. They didn't quite make that mark. Willowbrook ended up closing in 1987. But the fact is that the state of New York was now saying, hey, Willowbrook just isn't working. We've got to close Willowbrook. We need to put people that were at Willowbrook in community residences. That not only helped the people that were then at Willowbrook, but helped almost everyone in New York State with a developmental disability and their families, because it institutionalized, that's probably a wrong term to use, but what it did is that it put in place rules and procedures, and it gave hope to people. Today, the consent judgment, what grew out of that consent judgment is what we have today in many, many communities. We have community residences. We have appropriate programs. We have educational opportunities. We have jobs. Lots and lots of things have happened, and it's all stems from the consent judgment in 1975.
And the work of those parents and activists to push through to that court case. Some of the people, as Laura said, that were here, Willamette Goodman and Diana McCourt and Jerry Isaacs, and I don't want to miss anyone's name, but they all know who they are. Yeah. What a tremendous, and Murray Schneps, what a tremendous confluence of passionate,
absolutely
perceptive people.
Right. Perceptive, and the lawyering that went on was exceptional. It really was. These people worked hard, and they continue to work hard, by the way. There is a woman by the name of Beth Harulis who works for the New York Civil Liberties Union. She continues to represent the Willowbrook class. And the consent judgment it was a class action, and the Willowbrook class started out initially with about 6,000 people. I think there's about 2,500 people that are left. The Willowbrook case will continue until the last resident that was at Willowbrook is alive. So the work is still out there, and the benefit that everyone with developmental disabilities gets in New York is because that case is still out there, and people are still focused on it, and the lawyers are still focused on it. And parents, most especially parents and guardians, are still focused on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's why Willowbrook is considered ground zero for the disabilities movement. Let's move on to Station 5, right? Which is isolation to inclusion, Laura.
Right, which is a huge, broad story when you think about the work that went into the lawsuit, the consent judgment. And if you put into context the voluntary agencies that were in existence from the 1940s outside of the institutions, they were building legislation initiatives to get special education included, to get clinics and do the work outside of the institutions that was helpful when we were then going to close Willowbrook in 1987. The organizations around New York State were there to help New York State empty the institutions by including them and arranging for people not only in the community but people in institutions, Willowbrook being the first. There was Letchworth and Rome and others. And that isolation to inclusion took a great deal of work on the part of so many organizations and professionals to move people back to their home community, to include them in schools and in day programs and in residences. This milestone, when we look at that, emptying the Willowbrook State School in 1987, we now have this empty campus, and we have the College of Staten Island moving in. It was actually the Staten Island Community College and Richmond College, two-year colleges merging into one 4-year campus, and that happened in 1993. And at that time, when you think of converting an institution like Willowbrook to a city university, 4-year college, it speaks volumes to also what was happening at the same time outside of the college, in that we had education until age 21. We have the college training our physical therapists, our occupational therapists. The broadening of people living in the community from institutions helped really make New York a leader in the country. The College of Staten Island hosts the Melissa Riggio Higher Education Transition Program, which is something AHRC New York City created in the early 2000s through a relationship with the City University, and the College of Staten Island now has hosted that program since 2006, where we have people with intellectual disabilities on campus working now for a 4-year program, as all people who graduate from high school and go to college do, to get ready for adult life. So Milestone 5 really speaks to the transition from Willowbrook to the College of Staten Island. It talks about the transition from isolation in an institution to really being involved in the community. So there's a lot of attachment to that one.
We did. We already discussed the exposing conditions, which is Station 6. The Station 7, which is the baby unit, when I started at Willowbrook, it was at the baby unit in Building 26. At that time, Laura talks about the change from children's rights just in terms of going to the Board of Ed, which they didn't have the ability to do until 1974. But parents didn't have options at that time. There were no services, and people saw Willowbrook State School as a possible resource for them. They couldn't have known the type of situation that they were placing their children in. The baby unit was built in the 1960s. Originally, when Willowbrook opened, it was taking older, children, but not toddlers, and people that were older, teenagers, whatever, but in terms of age groups. But in the 1960s, the state saw this influx and need, and they were trying to actually do a good thing, but that effort was not sustained. So the baby unit opens in the 1960s. And I tell the story always. This is the key that I was given when I started there. I was given that key, and I'll tell the story in a short version. I went to the building. I opened the first door. It was a heavy steel door. I opened the second door. It was a heavy steel door with this lock. And I have to go to a third door. I'm walking down a drab hallway. I'm thinking, who has to be locked behind 3 steel doors? And I'm starting to be a little concerned, but I was 19 at the time and thought, well, I'm here. And I put the key in. I turned the lock. I pushed the door open. And behind that door were 40 toddlers. Some came over, asked me my name, pulling at my slacks. Others were sitting at a table. Others were sitting on the floor. Most of them were not occupied in any meaningful activity. But there was one thing in common with all of them. They were just children. And that surreal scene, that environment for me has never left. I still get a tinge in my stomach when I tell the story. And it's really what I always say, that those toddlers that day abducted me. The little boy that I worked with named Joshua, he learned to walk when he was 6. Children learn to walk in the developmental stages. Some of it is based on the curiosity to get from one place to another. When children are in an institution and there is nothing that motivates them, Joshua took his first steps towards me. And I think about that often, that we just need to give children the resources that they need and the resources cannot exist in a secluded place without services or without staff to assist them. The baby unit is a sad story of what our society has allowed to happen to our children at times. The Conley Center, Laura, which the Conley Center actually is the baby unit,
Yes.
right? It's the same building complex.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and still busy today. Betty Conley. Betty Conley was the first woman elected to elected office on Staten Island, and as soon as she was elected in 1973, she moved that office to Willowbrook State School, and from that point on became such a strong advocate for people with intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, and mental illness, and was a staunch advocate for change in Albany. And, you know, as a young mother going back to 1990, and my daughter Julia was 8, and I joined the DD Council, and I was on the advocacy committee, and we would meet with her periodically, and at her office, which continued to be on the grounds of the Developmental Center. And she was a powerful woman by 19. I mean, she was powerful the day she opened her office, but she was traumatic, she was effective, and we would get such guidance from her. And she always said, you know, you have to be strong. You're only one budget cut away from another Willowbrook, and she would guide us. And I didn't realize until much later how wonderful it was to have Betty right in our neighborhood.
Have that access.
And to have that guidance. And she did fought to the very end. And the Conley Center, we have the pool, which she fought to get. She was a woman who ended up being, you know, the head of the assembly, pro tem, and a legacy that is hard to match by others. I know, Hal, you spent a lot of time speaking about her.
I did think a lot about Betty, and I actually was honored to deliver a paper at the first symposium that IBR had about Betty Conley and autism. And in preparing for giving that talk, I spoke to Mario Cuomo, and I was fortunate enough to have Mario Cuomo in my law firm, and asked him about Betty. And I mean, he just said Betty Conley is the most effective, or was the most effective legislator in Albany. And the reason why, I asked him, I said, well, why was she effective? He said, because she cared. She cared about what she did. She cared about the people that she represented. She cared about people with developmental disabilities. I asked him, I said, you know, Governor, how is it that Willowbrook came about? He said, there were no votes at Willowbrook, Al. That's how Willowbrook came about. I said, but what about Betty Conley? I mean, he said, oh, Betty Conley is different. She's much, much different. So as a Staten Islander, we really were blessed, and I think all of New York State was blessed to have somebody of the caliber and the passion of Betty Conley.
And
She
right
also
now,
wrote the bill to create OMRDD at the time in 1978 to pull us away from the Department of Mental Hygiene, which we were not patients. We had developmental disabilities, and through her bill and those efforts, went on to form the Office of Mental Retardation.
And that's one of our concerns now. When we look at today, there are certain markers that are in place, and the attempt to move us under the Department of Health is something that we're looking at for that same thing, because it's a reversal, because our people are not patients.
Right.
They're people in need of services.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on to Building 29, because I want to make sure we get the 4 stations in. Building 29 is a building that was designated as the Staten Island building as deinstitutionalization began, and the people that were originally from Staten Island were in that building. The plans, though, for Building 29 is that hopefully in the future that it will be where the archives are. It will be a center of excellence. It will be a media host. It will have an annual conference. That's our plans for Building 29 and how we move forward.
It would be an enormous benefit to the college to create that kind of center.
Yeah, and I think
incorporating all of
it's a collaborative project that we need to do with the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, with the college, and with the DD Council.
So to our audience out there, stay tuned.
Stay tuned. We're hoping that this is going to happen,
The
just
mile
like
is
the mile.
growing.
The mile will be 2 miles shortly.
Right. Okay, we have 3 stations left. IBR, Hal?
IBR.
The Institute,
Yeah,
the Institute for Basic Research, which is located on Forest Hill Avenue.
Right. The Institute for Basic Research is a place that a bunch of scientists and researchers work at every day, trying to figure out what autism is all about, or what Fragile X is all about, or Down syndrome is all about.
Interesting. Also, they've been working on an Alzheimer's connection with Down syndrome for the last number of years.
Yeah,
which
they have been,
very,
and they're having some success with that too.
Yes.
I might add. But to what is IBR? Well, Diane said it's the Institute for Basic Research. Back in the 1940s, parents in New York started to suggest to the state of New York, why do we have mental retardation? Why do we have autism? What can be done? And of course, the answer is let's do some research. Let's try to figure this out. So the parents really put a push behind this, and Governor Harriman signed legislation to look at creating some sort of institute. There were institutes at the time for psychiatric behavior, but he was interested in some sort of research facility for basic research. In 1958, Governor Nelson Rockefeller actually signed legislation that did create the Institute for Basic Research. It was decided, again, with a lot of parent input, to have it on Staten Island. There was a little bit of a fight in Albany as to where this would go. And of course, once again, it's a big government operation. There's going to be building, there's going to be job opportunities. People were suggesting that it be in Manhattan.
It needed to be near a large city, so the scientists would be encouraged to be right here.
To come, right. And again, with the help of parents, active parents at Willowbrook, and in New York City, they decided that they would put it on Staten Island. So in 1964, the building actually was built. And since that time, it has done tremendous research and has had significant findings in PKU, dieting. But again, IBR is always under the gun, if you will. The government, ever since Rockefeller signed the legislation, I think one governor after another has been trying to close it. And because of the great advocacy of us, and back to Betty Conley, her great advocacy as well, we've been able to maintain it and keep it open. And I'd like to think that this last budget go-around, this new governor is beginning to look at the real value of IBR, and has decided that we're going to try to keep it open, and that we are not going to move it to a university, for instance, but keep it open and keep it on Staten Island. That's
Let's
all
move
good
then.
news.
Let's move right then to the hepatitis study, which is not at all connected to IBR.
Yeah, I think it's got to be really clear that this different studies, the hepatitis study, which this is what was going on. In the 1956, I believe, some scientist over at NYU decided that it might be a great idea to infect people at Willowbrook with hepatitis to see if they could come up with some sort of cure. Well, it sort of backfired. Not only did they give some people at the Willowbrook hepatitis, but at the end of the day, or the end of the year, 100% of the people at Willowbrook had hepatitis. These were people that were being experimented on without their consent, without their family's consent, highly unethical. Even at the time, people were a little like, should we really be doing this thing? Well, of course, some of the scientists, based upon the Tuscany syphilis experiments down in the South, where they did the same thing to African-American soldiers, where they infected them with syphilis to come up with some sort of cure. It was wrong. It was wrong then, and it's wrong now. It's unethical. You need to have consent. There was no consent. In Willowbrook's, there was a position that was taken by the director of the Willowbrook State School that if you really wanted to get your child admitted to Willowbrook because there was overcrowding and they weren't putting people in. He made the people consent to being part of the hepatitis study, which was also terribly wrong. The good news is that it can't happen anymore. The federal government has stepped in and there are laws about it. But up until 1971 or 72, that was pretty much the norm, and we've gotten past that. But again, I want to reiterate this. The hepatitis study had nothing to do with the Institute of Basic Research then, or now, or forever.
The last station is Station 12, and that's Gouverneur State School, Laura. And I want to just to explain that. It's a very important part, but I want to leave a little bit at the end so we can wrap up the story.
Station 12, Gouverneur Hospital, and it's incredible to think that this happened in 1962 to a group, maybe 200 children that were at Willowbrook in 1962 with significant medical disabilities. And as Willowbrook became too crowded, they felt, well, we can't help them here, we're going to move them. And so where did they move them? To a condemned hospital in Manhattan, the Gouverneur Hospital, that had been condemned. So you bring 200 of your most fragile children to a condemned hospital, Gouverneur. And it wasn't until about 9 years later that the parents were told, we're going to move your children back to Willowbrook. And Willie Mae Goodman, Jose Rivera, whose mother had her son there, these giants fought the state, initiated a lawsuit, used the community. They had the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, the journalists, and successfully began a suit in 1971 to keep their children there. By then they were getting okay treatment, but to get better treatment. And that really inspired the next lawsuit in 72.
Yeah.
So they were
Unbelievable that
it's
a pivotal
would do
story, and it's very, very powerful.
Yes.
There's the concept that they would transfer 200 children to a condemned building.
Right.
Unreal. So here are the 12 stations. So this legacy built a system of focus and care. It changed something. But is this struggle still ongoing? Where are we now? Walking this mile, which we hope our audience will do, is meant to stir critical thinking and to open our minds to understand what happened in the past so we change our direction in the future. So the struggle today is ongoing. I mean, the pandemic has only exacerbated things. I mean, most agencies are running at a 30% vacancy rate right now. We went through devastating cuts in the Como time. Over $150 million of just taken out. So no matter what Hochul has done to this point, we are so far behind. The movement to the Department of Health, the lack of staff, and the lack of services. Those four markers were what was in place for the Willowbrook tragedy when it started to really go downhill, because the intent was good. They opened the state school. The intent was good, but then they didn't sustain the effort.
Right.
Those four markers are in place now.
The crisis is back.
The crisis
Only the crisis is not as visible.
It looks different.
It's different. I look back with such gratitude and appreciation for everything that went on in those 12 stations, because Julia was 5 years old going into kindergarten in 1987 when they were closing Willowbrook. Had she been born 10 years before that, she would have had nothing. So as a parent in 1987, we fell into services without a hitch. And looking back at what those parents went through, how grateful we were that we were able to get those services. And now I look, the last 40 years of Julia's life, special education, a residential program. These were opportunities that we enjoyed and they needed and were there for people. But now you look at the cuts that you just indicated and you start to see the rollback, the Betty Conley saying one cut away from Willowbrook. And I do express the concern that I know thousands of parents have across the country. The providers are losing staff. The salaries haven't been able to be incorporated into the rates that voluntaries get to care for our loved ones. And so this ongoing struggle makes me very concerned that the crisis is here, folks. The parents who are waiting for services, the parents who have services now and see less of an ability to be incorporated into the community, is something that New York legislature has to take stock of. You know, you went from some of the best to now we're worried about the health and the safety of people that are trapped in nursing homes, trapped at home with parents who are aging and can't get a permanent place in the community. So it's really there, and I think this is the basis for the conversation needed to go forward, to look at what's working now, what's not working, how can we innovate, how can we use our resources wisely. But we have to know that Washington needs to understand the needs of the states. And right now, we are at that point where our crisis might be hidden by other more serious crises. And they're not more serious, but we need to make sure our crisis gets the kind of Geraldo attention in the 2022 year. And this is a great start for that conversation.
I mean, I used to look at Willowbrook, the lawsuit itself, as government's ignorance, arrogance, and indifference. Ignorance because government didn't know. Arrogance because it always thought it did, always had all of the answers. But at the end of the day, it was indifference. They didn't give a damn. What I see today is that government is no longer ignorant. They know exactly what's going on. They're not even arrogant anymore. Again, they know what is happening, and they know how to fix it. It's the indifference. And I think that what parents and advocates need to do is to impress upon our legislators, it's this indifference. You need to step up to the plate. I used to love it when politicians running for office would always proclaim, well, I'm going to be like Betty Conley. I'm going to be like Betty Conley. Well, damn it, be like Betty Conley. Don't tell me how that you want to be like Betty Conley. I want you really to be Betty Conley and to think about some of these issues. There really are answers to this stuff. And it doesn't always come down to money. You know, everybody says, oh, it's the pocketbook issues. It's not always the pocketbook issues. It's, do you care enough? Can you figure out what the problem is?
Yeah.
Can you do that? I think in some respects, Diane, when you mentioned COVID and the pandemic, that has forced government to look at things a little bit differently. Hopefully they'll take a look at our field and come up with different kinds of answers. And of course, include parents, include providers in that discussion, in that dialogue.
And I've come to the point where I say to myself, you know, it's not enough to be an advocate. You have to be an activist. Mm-hmm. In other words, you can support something, but you need to do something.
Yes, mm-hmm.
You know, there's that old African saying, you know, when you pray, move your feet. Mm-hmm. You can pray and hope that the guards are going to intervene and help you, but move your feet. Right. Start to do something. Yeah. And I think the mile, I hope it's going to give us some footing in that. I hope more people, it's going to be exposed to more people and to get them involved. I mean, we have benches along the mile, and we've tried to involve different community groups. You know, you're always so passionate about Halloran Hospital, and I think about that Defoe had this concept of the recovery of the soldier, not only physically but emotionally. Mm-hmm. So he set up that environment. And so who's going to be a bench at that mile, but Tunnel to Towers? This is a group that brings that into the future, right? That advocacy for the recovery of the soldier, and all along the mile, it gives opportunities for people to step up and say, I'm on this journey with you. This is a social justice issue for all people. For all people. For all people.
Serving on the AHRC board in the ARC of New York, which was a plaintiff in the Willowbrook lawsuit, and the Benevolent Society, Jerry Isaacs was a chapter of the ARC. And being a new parent on the board in 1993, I got to know many of the founders and many of the people who carried the ball for using the legislature to get what they wanted. And they had a newsletter, Our Children's Voice, Our Voice Today, over 30 years. There was one editorial where early on they were fighting for education for children whose IQs were below 50. because they were left out. And they fought 10 years for that. The editorial said, we lost, and they learned that politeness is not going to work. Politeness isn't going to work. We're not going to dance around this anymore. We are looking at social justice. We're looking at doing the right thing. And that's what the legislators need to benefit by, are telling them what's the right thing to do.
You mentioned the word editorial, which reminds me of Brian Leyline's most recent editorial. And I think it was called Like No Other Event. Willowbrook there is no other event like Willowbrook to the history of Staten Island. It changed the world, in a sense, in terms of how people with disabilities, what their lives should be like, and what they should never be like, what no one's life should be like, right?
I have to, Eric Rosenthal,
yeah, sure.
I have to get this in because you just moved this. In 2000, we were doing the event at the college, the 25th anniversary of the consent judgment. And that month in the New York Times Magazine was the Global Willowbrook. And it was about Eric Rosenthal, who was a young attorney who started to go around the world. And it was all about using the Willowbrook consent judgment to sue these countries. They started in Mexico and Turkey. And he would come in, and the government didn't know it was 2 or 3 attorneys, and they would use that to change the world, the model. And so when he looks back, he said to me one time, we honored him at one of our dinners, he said, $10,000, you could change a country. With the advocacy, he said, what these countries need is the advocacy. And we never could get there, but, we had it here, and it worked.
And his piece, though, I think on the advocacy was not just going in and suing a government. His point was, I can go out and I can get parents and guardians on our side. I can explain to them that in America, on Staten Island, there was a lawsuit that was brought by parents, and there was a judgment, and things changed. He said that was the message that I was bringing to folks. I was giving them hope. I was saying you can make change. And at the end of the day, we don't need these institutions. We need community residences. We need jobs. We need educational opportunities. And he was right then, and he's right today.
He's right now.
And the college is living and breathing that, I think, now with all of its programs. And City University has done an enormous amount of work in disability studies and training.
Well, I want to thank the two of you for being here today. You just bring so much information and your passion that I share with you, and I'm so proud to be with you in this journey. I want to thank Staten Island Community Television. They've been a wonderful sponsor of this and supportive, and we hope to do more work with them in the future. Naturally, the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities Council, just long-term advocacy and activism. And the College of Staten Island. And
this event
coming up. We also have an event, Bill Bronston on the 20th is 2:30 at the college is having public hostage, public ransom, ending the institutional system in America. And Hal, you have a show.
At the Historical Society of the New York Courts on September 22nd. If you Google it, you'll see it's both going to be at the Bar Association. It's going to be online and in person. Everyone is invited. There's no cost. And you'll listen to the lawyers that brought the original Willowbrook lawsuit, and that Beth Harulis that I mentioned, who is carrying it forward today. So thank you all for listening. I hope that this has sparked some interest in you, that you'll join us on the mile, that you'll join us on this journey, and that this mile, I hope, will stir some critical thinking.
Continue conversation.
Continue the conversation and move us forward.
And move our feet.
And we can pray, but let's also move our feet, right? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you for your leadership with all of this.
It's been an honor for me, to tell you the truth. It's been an honor.